The first thing that you probably do while you're setting up on the bench is set up your shoulders, set up your scapula. Now the bench is definitely an obstacle which gets in the way of, being really able to protract and retract your scapula however you want, like you would be on, like, let's say a cable press. For the sake of cutting your range of motion, you want to be maximally retracted at the bottom of your bench. So you want to be retracted enough at the start to allow you to get into that position, while still allowing for some movement. Because you don't want your scapula to be pinned in that maximally retracted position the whole time, as you will not feel nearly as stable doing that as if you let your scapula move slightly. How I personally do it is one shoulder at a time. I dig in my right, then I dig in my left, and that's about it. Looking at high level benchers though, more often than not, they're setting both their shoulders at the same time, so it's definitely not my way is the only way. The second thing is setting your feet. Now we need to remember that the only direction of leg drive that matters is forward. We need to push this way to push ourselves that way. If we're pushing this way, it's not going to do much for the sake of positioning on the bench press. So you want your quad facing forward. The more abducted you are, the harder it is to use that quad to sort of leg extend that force forward. Which is why I mostly recommend a toes forward bench over a toes sideways bench. However, we need to remember that the first goal over everything is lifting to competition standard on competition equipment. If turning your toes slightly out a little more lets you grip the floor better without slipping as much, and lets you keep your ass on the bench better, which both of those problems are sometimes solved by turning the feet slightly outwards, then it is almost always worth it. But if you can get away with the toes forward, that is what I recommend, that is what I do. When it comes to whether you want your toes out in front or cranked back, you see very successful benchers doing both. And what it comes down to is you are allowed to have any part of your butt touching the bench in competition, even if it's the very lowest part. So it is an advantage to have your knees below your hips, so that you can get that sort of high angle at the hip to be able to just touch the bottom part. And for that reason, most people with a big arch would prefer to have their feet either cranked back or cranked way out in front, because both those positions allow for a low knee position, where if your knees are directly under, the knees are pretty high and the hips can't reach that very high angle. There's a few things to consider here. Honestly, it all comes down to practice. Try both, see what feels better. Ankle mobility is a big one. Some people, they just don't have the ankle mobility to be able to crank their feet all the way back. They need heels to do that, and some people just don't like benching in heels. I'll come to the shoe choice later on. When you have your feet out in front, more people doing this get sort of foot slipping issues than people going back, especially on the Eleiko carpet. Almost everyone I've seen benching with their feet out in front, even if they're wearing the grippiest shoes, get some degree of slipping while they're benching on competition carpet. Another thing that I found completely anecdotally, when I have my feet completely out in front, it's much easier for me to get to consistent position. But when I have my feet far back, I'm more likely to have good arch days, bad arch days, days where my ass just pops off the bench, days where my ass stays on. And the feet out position is generally more comfortable to be in for long rep work. One final point about feet position is not only toe angle and in front and back, but also how far to the side or how close in. Again, similar to the toe angle point, if you have them close, the quads are sort of in the same direction as you want your leg drive, and it's a little easier to create that leg extension force forward. Another thing to think about when it's closer in, personally for me, if I'm on like a fat pad like this or the old Eleiko soft pad, I can squeeze the bench like crazy, and I get a lot of stability from that. So I enjoy having my feet very close to the bench, and I think more people should. There's a few points which can make you go to a further out to the side sort of stance. It almost acts like a wider tripod where you're more stable. So if you're the type to get a lot of seesawing, if you're the type to get a lot of like seesawing on the bench, that wider tripod position could help you in stability, especially if you're not the type that squeezes the bench a lot with your thighs, so you won't lose much from going a bit wider. And also, a lot of people just find it much easier to keep their ass on the bench when they have the feet wider. Now here comes one of the most important parts of setting your arch, and that is using your leg drive to get your weight up onto your nape or even your neck. When you already have your shoulders set on the bench and you use your leg drive to push forward and almost push your neck, think like long neck, away from the shoulders, that accomplishes the depression that you need to get that low touch point. And missing this step is a very common reason of when you see people arching their lower back really hard, but really they're not getting much height on their chest. So one of the easiest ways of feeling what this feels like is to get your ass up off the bench and then to try doing it. So getting your ass up off the bench and then trying as hard as possible to push your body weight as high up as possible, close to your neck. So again, just get your ass up as high as possible and then think about getting your body weight, instead of resting down here, to up here and as high as possible, even all the way up here. So after all that, now your main goal, get your ass on the bench. You have to be very careful here because it's so easy to get into a good position and then just lose it all the way down. You need to be very careful and very slow and barely perch your ass on the bench. You don't want your ass to be squishing and compressed on the bench because you're just losing centimeters of height on your arch. You almost want to be thinking of bringing your hips back instead of bringing your hips down. So I'll just show an example right now. This bringing the ass down can be either done before the unrack or after the unrack. A lot of people like doing it before the unrack because it gets them into a more of a decline position for an easier unrack. If you're a big enough archer, you're already in that position while having your ass down. So I personally like unracking after I have my ass down because it lets me think about positioning first and then I think about the weight. And my position tends to stay the exact same after I unrack. The unrack itself, I know most people know this, but it should not be done at all with the scapula. You should not be unracking like this. You should be unracking almost completely with the tricep. The closer you are to the J-cup, the less likely you are to lose position while trying to unrack. If you think of it, if the bar is all the way in front and you're trying to reach the bar, right, you're more likely to lose that shoulder position, get that sort of pushing your shoulder out of position when you're trying to reach the bar, than if you only have to reach back this much. Right? But then comes the risk of just hitting the J-cup during training. It's pretty rare for people to hit the J-cup during competitions because of how small the Eleiko J-cup is. But that is just something to be mindful of, especially if you're going for a self-unrack, which I think is getting more and more popular over time. You want to be as close to the J-cup as possible without hitting it. A cue that I use sometimes is to only lock the triceps once you've gotten into that final position horizontally. This is just because it's easier to maintain that scapular position when your triceps are soft and to only need to lock out here instead of keeping it locked out while you're moving the scapula, unracking and dragging the bar forward. It makes it easier to maintain your shoulder position. You do want to be putting the bar very low in your hands, but still be able to get a good grip of it. And then I like very slightly internally rotating my hand in so that it gets even closer to that wrist. I'm not really going to go into bulldog grip because I've never used it and none of my clients use it. When you bring the bar forward, you want to bring it directly above the touch point. One thing to note is that when you crank your wrists back a little bit, it makes it easier to get to that really low touch point without feeling like the bar is almost going to collapse in front of your elbow, which is a common thing when you try to keep that very neutral wrist and get that low touch point still. Just before I descend, I think about breathing. The main difference there is between breathing in the squat and breathing in the bench is the position of the diaphragm. While in the squat, you want to get into a basically exhaled position, pack down, and breathe to keep the ribs in the exact same position they are. While in the bench, you want to flare those ribs out and get the diaphragm up. Sort of like you're doing a bodybuilding vacuum pose, but with full lungs of air. After I breathe, I then tense the obliques, and that helps me keep stable and get a little bit of extra height on the ribs. On the downwards phase, I very often cue absolutely nothing. When it comes to the scapula, some people enjoy cueing to retract as they go down, and some people prefer to just cue absolutely nothing and just let that happen naturally. What you don't want to cue though is to think about the scapula the whole time, to think about what your elbows are doing the whole time. In my opinion, it's best to just think about the touch point and let everything happen as it happens. And this is especially more important on the way up. Just push the bar. I'll talk about some equipment stuff now. You hear it time and time again. The goal of the wrist wrap is to cast your wrist so you can't move it at all. It's fully neutral. That's not true. A lot of people get carried away with that kind of thinking and they get the longest wrist wrap they can get and the stiffest wrap they can get. I'll always prefer flexible wrist wraps. These are the SBD flexibles and I prefer them a million times over the SBD stiffs. This is because they can perfectly wrap around the hand without gaps on top and on the bottom. They're also just a lot more comfortable and actually allow me to crank my wrist back slightly and feel really well supported, where on a stiff one, it doesn't really feel supported, it just feels sharp. When it comes to shoes, my 3 recommendations are these. The Notorious Lift Sumo Sole Gen 2, the feiyues low, and the low hypervs. When I say Sumo Sole Gen 2, it's because you want this sole pattern. The Sumo Sole Gen 2.5 is made with a much thinner sole pattern, which is not as grippy and a lot thinner, which makes it wear out much quicker. The feiyues, in my experience, have the absolute best grip out of these 3. And the hypervs are a close second, but all 3 of these shoes are very good on Lego carpet. A shot for competition use, if you do slip a lot, is to get a spray bottle like this and fill it with sugar water. Now the IPF rules state that there's no adhesives allowed, but as far as I know, sugar water, Coca-Cola are fully allowed. So what you want to do is just spray them, light coat, 4, 5, 6 minutes before each bench attempt. Stay away from any baby powder or chalk on the floor. Keep them off and just upside down up until you go for your attempt. Last piece of equipment I want to talk about is benching with a belt. Now, straight out the bat, if you have a big arch, benching with a belt could limit that by a lot, especially if it's a big belt like this. If you don't have a big arch, benching with a belt can have 2 advantages. One is proprioception when it comes to breathing, feeling where your breath goes. And the second, if you are a chunky boy, is to bring your fat up towards your touch point. So you can actually set the belt in a way which pushes your fat slightly up. And if you have quite a lot of fat here, then that can bring your touch point up by a couple of centimeters.